What's up guys, welcome to the channel. My name's Alex and today we're going to be talking about compound interest. Compound interest is a fundamental part of wealth creation and it's critical for your own financial success that you know what it is so that you can take advantage of it, and just as importantly to make sure that it doesn't take advantage of you. So what do I mean by this? It sounds like there could be some possible positive and negative connotations around compound interest, and this is actually very true. Albert Einstein stated that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it, earns it, and he who doesn't, pays it. And if Einstein is so impressed by it, it's certainly worth talking about. Before we can fully understand what compound interest is, I think it's first important to define interest. So interest is what your asset will generate for you by lending it out, or what you will pay for the privilege of borrowing an asset. By which I mean, if you lend someone money, you would expect them to pay you back that money plus some interest. Or on the other side of that, if you are borrowing some money, you would expect to eventually pay them back that money with a little bit of interest as compensation. You wouldn't necessarily expect to take on the risk or the outlay of lending someone your capital or even borrowing someone's capital without expecting there to be some kind of incentive for you or them to do so. So that's essentially all interest is. The amount of interest specifically that's calculated is determined by a couple of things. The first of those is the interest rate. This is often described as a per year or per annum percentage. It can vary very greatly for a number of reasons, such as what kind of a loan it is, what the terms of it are, how long it is, who you're borrowing with or who you're borrowing against, what the asset might be that it's secured against, if any, the purpose of the loan, what your credit history might be like, or your previous history of repayments or negligence, or if you've been bankrupt before. All those kind of things can be taken into account when reflecting an interest rate specifically to you, depending on what you're talking about. Some examples of areas where interest rates are very important are things like mortgages, personal loans, car loans, student loans in some cases, and then on the flip side for you it could be investment returns, things like savings accounts, dividends, all that kind of thing. So on top of the interest rate, what also constitutes how much interest amounts are payable are things such as the actual amount being lent or being borrowed, as this is usually what the interest rate is calculated against, as well as the term of the loan. So for example, it's a 1-year loan, or if it's a 5-year loan, that will also be taken into account. So just to recap, interest is a fee paid or received on money borrowed or lent, and the interest amount is based on the interest rate, term, and amount being borrowed or lent. If this isn't making sense yet, do not worry. It is a little bit complicated and there's a couple of terms being floating around, but the next part should clarify things up for you with some examples. So there are two main ways that interest is calculated, and those are simple interest and compound interest. You may be familiar with both of these terms, but you might not fully understand the difference and why some of them may be better or worse in some circumstances for you. Simple interest is the simpler of the two, as the name implies, and it is basically where the interest is calculated based on the initial principal of your deal and nothing else. As an example, let's say you put $1,000 in a 1-year term deposit with your local bank. This is essentially you loaning money to the bank just as they could to another person. They will opt to pay you an interest rate, and let's say for this example that is a simple interest rate calculated at 2% per annum that's going to be paid out at completion of the deal, that being 12 months from now. So after that 1 year, you'll get your initial deposit back, plus the interest that you've now accrued, meaning that you'll actually get $1,020 back. The $1,000 being the money you put up front to lend to the bank will be repaid in full, plus $20, which is the interest that was earned on that $1,000, and that's calculated as 2% of that $1,000. Simple, yes? Hence the name, simple interest. So now if you want to know how this would work on the borrower's side, or if you were the one actually receiving the money for that period and having to pay it back, just think of it from being in the bank's shoes in that scenario. In that case, you'd borrow $1,000 for 1 year, and then at the end of that year you'd be expected to pay that $1,000 back in full, plus an extra $20 for an interest charge, which means that you would then owe the lender $1,020. Doesn't sound too bad, right? But it can be better and it can be worse. This is where compound interest is really king, and if you know how to use it, it's absolutely better than simple interest in just about every way. Compound interest means that you generate interest on both your principal amount and the interest earned on your principal amount, compounding in certain intervals. This means that the interest you earn at certain time intervals is added back onto the principal amount, and then the interest once again can kind of recalculate on that new amount. So over time you'll find that the interest you're earning is increasing as well as the principal amount. This will get faster in the later years as well as it becomes more powerful. So now to illustrate this point, Let's look back at our previous example, lending $1,000 to a local bank with a 2% per annum interest rate over 1 year. Except this time, instead of calculating it with simple interest, we're going to be using compound interest calculated monthly. What that means is that every month the interest will be applied to that principal balance, and then the next month that will be calculated again, taking into account this new balance. So at the end of this year, you'd now receive a total amount back of $1,020.18. It might not sound like a huge difference, but this is just a simple example over a 1 year with a low interest rate, and the real power of this comes over a long span of time, like 20, 30 or 40 years with regular investments made along the way, as you'll quickly see that compound interest actually begins to snowball exponentially over the years and can eventually overtake your earning and saving potential in the long term. So just to explain as well, so the reason we actually do get that 18 cents in this example at the end of the year is because rather than the interest being applied and calculated simply on that first amount and then added in at the end when we get the money back, it's actually calculated on a monthly basis. The proportional amount is then added to that principal amount, and then that revised principal amount is used when calculating the interest again for the following month. So the interest earned in month 1 is added, and then in month 2 the interest is calculated based off the original amount and the interest earned in month 1, and so on. So it keeps on building and building on itself like that. And once again, if you were using the borrower's example as the bank, you'd have to pay back $1,000 plus $20.18 using the compound interest example. I want to show a graph real quick that's going to explain this a little bit more clearly over the long term. You'll see that there's the invested amount, which is how much capital you're actually putting into the deal. In our example before, that was the $1,000. Then you'll see a line for the simple interest, and you'll notice that that's a very linear line. It only really increases very, very slowly over time, and that is because it's only going to go up based on how much money you're actually putting into the deal. The compound interest line you'll see is increasing exponentially, and it gets very, very serious towards the latter half of the graph. This is because compound interest keeps on building on itself and working for you. This is what they literally mean when they say get your money working for you. You want interest to be generating on your money, and you want interest to be generating on the interest generating on your money. Sounds funny, but it's awesome for you. So you can imagine as well in the latter years, if you're talking about hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of dollars, if you're looking at something like an investment portfolio or a retirement fund, you can see that compound interest is actually going to be able to overtake the money you might actually be able to save just from working or putting money away from your other income. So that's why investing is super important, and that's why understanding and taking advantage of compound interest is extremely critical as well. So why did Einstein also then say that those who don't understand compound interest will pay? This is because, like we used with our example, the borrower, when using the compound interest example, actually had to pay more in that scenario. And if you're in the circumstance where you owe someone or some entity money and it's being compounded like that over a significant period of time and on a significant period of money, the compounding will start to get very, very aggressive, and the amount of money you actually owe could start to snowball out of control faster than you can save money to pay off that debt. So if you take, for example, a credit card with a fairly high interest rate of something in the 20% region, if you have, say, $10,000 owing on that card, every year that's going to start jumping up by hundreds or even thousands of dollars at some point, which might be faster than you want to pay off. So you need to be very, very aware of what kind of debts you're willing to take on if you have to, so that you don't get potentially caught on a trap of having compound interest working against you, where it's a lot harder to pay off that debt, whereas if you just paid for something in cash or didn't buy it at all. So what do I want you to take away from this video? Essentially that compound interest is really cool, and that Einstein certainly knows what he's talking about. I also want you to understand the power of compound interest, so that now you'll be more motivated to begin investing earlier and more consistently to take advantage of it over the long term. By doing so, you'll ensure that compound interest can begin working for you, and this can catapult your investment portfolio into the latter years and help you retire sooner and more comfortably. And on the flip side of that, I want to make sure you're very cautious when you're considering taking on any debts. You need to be wary of the fact that compound interest can be there, and it can bite you in the long run if you're not paying off these debts as quickly as possible. You don't want to be the kind of person that ends up with tens of thousands of dollars of useless credit card debt, or a car they can't afford to pay off or are upside down on, which is even worse. So just be mindful when you're doing things like this that you want to just look at the advantages, the disadvantage, as well as the opportunity costs, and making sure that you're comfortable with the fact that compound interest could be working in your favor, but it could also be working against it in some scenarios. I'm not saying that all debt is bad. There are some definitions of good debt and bad debt, but that's a topic for another video. As a bit of a blanket rule, Do try to avoid debt where you can, unless that debt is making you more money than it's costing you. But even that can be risky. Anyway guys, that's all for today's video. I hope that today's video has helped you understand a little bit more about compound interest and that you're now more motivated to keep it in mind when you're making financial decisions in the future. I'll have a blog post link below about compound interest to go into this in a little bit more detail, and if you would like to actually have a play with some interest calculators, I'll link some of those in the description. Those aren't affiliated with myself, so I'm not responsible if those websites go down in the future or anything, but I just thought they might be fun for you guys to play with and see if you can visualize how compound interest can have some effect when you play with it with larger amounts of money and over longer periods of time, just to fully drill the point home for you. So once again, I'm Alex, thanks for joining me today. Please consider subscribing for more videos and like the video if you found it helpful. See you in the next one. Bye guys. Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about compound interest. What are my hands doing?